Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're taking on a really big challenge.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
Trying to understand the world ourselves, our knowledge, reality itself, all through the eyes of, well, Bertrand Russell.
Ah, Russell. Okay, big indeed. And we're using an outline of philosophy.
That's right, excerpts from it, published way back in 1927.
Right, and that one was based on lectures, wasn't it? Aimed at a general American audience trying to make philosophy, accessible.
Exactly. So our mission today is basically to filter these ideas down, pull out the key insights, maybe the surprising
The
bits.
stuff that makes you go,
Yeah. The things that might genuinely shift how you think about knowledge, the physical world, mind, ethics, all that good stuff, guided by Russell.
And Russell kicks things off in a, well, typically philosophical way. He starts by doubting common sense knowledge.
Okay, hold on. Doubting common sense, that sounds a bit odd. Why start there? Isn't common sense usually, sensible?
Well, Russell's point is, while it gets us through the day, common sense is often, and this is his phrase, cocksure, vague, and self-contradictory.
Cocksure and vague.
Yeah.
Okay, I can maybe see that. Self-contradictory.
Think about it. We often hold beliefs that, if you really push on them, don't quite line up, or they're fuzzier than we admit. His goal isn't just doubt for doubt's sake.
Right.
It's to replace that fuzzy stuff with something better, knowledge that's tentative where it needs to be, precise, and really importantly, self-consistent.
So a more rigorous foundation. And he sees philosophy working with science,
Right.
not just following behind.
Exactly. Science is great at accumulating facts, building models, but Russell thinks philosophy's job is to look critically at the concepts science uses, like things, space, time, causation. These basic ideas we borrow from common sense.
Oh, okay.
And when science, like, relativity or quantum physics, shows that our common sense versions don't really cut it anymore,
Then philosophy needs to step in.
yeah, to try and reconstruct those fundamental ideas to fit the new scientific picture.
Okay, that makes sense. Science provides the new data. Philosophy helps redraw the basic map.
It's about clarifying the very landscape science is describing.
All right, let's dive into his approach in these sources. He starts by looking at man from without, focusing on behavior, learning, language, all very objectively.
Right. Heavily influenced by behaviorist psychology back then.
So studying what we do, not necessarily what we're thinking or feeling inside.
Pretty much. It's rooted in physiology, observable responses. What can you actually see and measure?
And he talks about studies on learning in animals and infants, which led to some interesting interpretations.
Oh, yeah, the classic critique he mentions. American behaviorists apparently saw animals rushing about, like frantically trying things until they stumbled on the answer.
Trial and error, basically.
Right, whereas German psychologists, the critique went, saw animals sitting still thinking and then suddenly having this insight.
Huh. So observer bias, maybe. American animals rush. German animals ponder.
It's a great reminder that even science can be shaped by underlying assumptions, Russell does add that different setups might genuinely produce different behaviors.
So the results aren't necessarily contradictory, but you got to be careful.
Definitely wary of anyone claiming the whole truth based on one method.
He uses Kuhler's work with chimpanzees quite a bit, right? Especially that idea of insight. Sultan the chimp.
The bananas out of reach, the boxes, the sticks. Yeah, classic stuff. Sultan figuring out how to pry out boxes or use a stick.
And the really famous bit was joining two short sticks together to make a long one.
Exactly. Kohler called that insight a complete solution appearing suddenly, taking in the whole situation.
But Russell adds a note of caution here.
He does. He points out, well, maybe Sultan accidentally fitted the sticks together first and then had the aha moment about reaching the banana.
So it wasn't necessarily a pure flash of insight from the start.
Kohler's definition required the solution to appear from the very beginning. Russell suggesting maybe an accidental discovery played a role. It just highlights how tricky it is to be sure if it's pure understanding or, a lucky accident followed by realization.
It definitely blurs the line. And that difficulty, it seems, applies more broadly to telling learned from unlearned responses just by watching.
Absolutely. Think about puberty behavior changes drastically, but it's maturation, not learning in the usual sense.
Right.
Or a baby learning to run. They can only run away from something scary after they've learned the skill of running, but running itself is learned.
And he mentions some reflexes in newborns might actually have been learned in the womb.
Yeah, so the line between instinct and learning, it's not always obvious just from observation.
It's amazing how complex even basic learning turns out to be. And Russell applies this behaviorist view really strongly to language.
He sees it not as some magical expression of inner thoughts, but more like a learned bodily habit.
Like riding a bike, he says.
Exactly. For him, this is a powerful argument for behaviourism. Words get associated with things, with responses.
Like Pavlov's dogs, but with words.
Sort of. The sight of a cat triggers the word cat. Hearing the word cat triggers some of the same reactions you'd have to an actual cat. It's all conditioning.
So kids learn to react to words first, then learn to use them later.
That's the idea. Through conditioning, he thinks learning single words isn't that different in principle from animals learning mazes.
Okay, but what about sentences? That seems way more complicated. How do we explain putting words together in totally new ways we've never heard before?
Right, or saying the same thing using completely different words.
Yeah, like telling one person, I saw Mr. Jones on the train, and another, Joseph was on the 9.35. How does simple association explain that?
That's where the behaviorist view really struggles, and Russell admits it. It seems like there's more going on than just verbal habit.
Does he have an answer?
He suggests meaning is tied to associations. Yeah, but sentences need more. He kind of floats the idea that maybe the stimulus triggers a common meaning, which then selects different ways to say it.
But wait, doesn't that sound like bringing thoughts back in through the back door?
Exactly. He notes it sounds suspiciously like the ideas behaviorism was trying to get rid of.
So it's a tricky point.
It is. But he pulls a key insight. Learning sentences involves learning structure, form. The difference between cats eat mice and mice eat cats isn't the words, it's the order, the relation.
Okay.
And our ability to handle that structure is somehow causally linked to the relational features of the world around us.
And he makes this subtle point about language itself maybe tripping us up.
Yeah, that words for relations like precedes or loves look just like words for things like lightning or cat.
Ah, so the noun-like structure of relation words might make us think relations are things.
Precisely. Our own language structure can subtly mislead how we think about reality structure. A really powerful observation about our main tool for thought.
Okay, fascinating. So that's the view from the outside, behavior, habits, language patterns. Let's switch gears completely now. The physical world, through the lens of early 20th century physics.
Right, and this is where things get really weird, and where science forces philosophy to seriously rethink basics. Modern physics relativity, quantum theory just blew common sense out of the water.
He talks about the atom, contrasting the older Bohr model.
The little solar system picture, electrons orbiting.
Right, which he says involved assumptions you couldn't directly check. Contrasting that with the newer theories, Heisenberg, Schrödinger.
And the key difference. The newer approach was way more abstract, and in a way more modest. It described the atom based only on what you could actually measure its radiations.
So what it emits or absorbs.
Exactly. It specifically didn't claim to describe what the electron was doing when it wasn't interacting, wasn't radiating. Electrons started looking less like tiny balls and more like, well, regions of energy potential or something.
The focus shifted to empirical verification. What can we actually observe?
Yeah, predicting results, not describing tiny, invisible machines, and then boom, relativity. Totally messing with space and time.
Our comfortable, fixed framework, gone.
Pretty much. A straight line. Depends on who's looking. Geometry, tied to physics.
And time. Well, time isn't this single cosmic clock. It's kind of local, personal to each bit of matter.
Yeah, it's still hard to wrap your head around. And then there's the shift he discusses from talking about bodies or things to talking about events.
This is profound. An event is just something happening at a specific place and time.
Okay.
And what we think of as a solid body, this desk, you, isn't seen as this single enduring thing. It's more like a string or a history of connected events.
Like a tune made of notes.
That's the analogy he uses, a history of events. Things are defined by the correlation of these events following laws. There's no evidence, Russell argues, for matter as some underlying stuff that persists beyond just being this series of connected events.
Wow. Okay, so this table isn't a thing in the old sense. It's a stable pattern of events happening here. That's the radical idea physics was pushing towards. He also connects this to our perception of force, like feeling pressure.
Right, that feeling seems very real, very direct.
But he points out the sensation of force is different from the physical concept. Think about phantom limbs stimulating nerves after an amputation can create the feeling of pressure in a limb that isn't there.
Ah, so the sensation is an event in the nervous system, not identical to the external cause.
Exactly. Which leads to this really crucial point about physics and perception. Physics gives us abstract structure, relations, patterns of events,
Okay.
but Russell claims we know absolutely nothing about the intrinsic quality, the what it's like of physical phenomena, except when they happen to be sensations occurring in us.
Whoa. Explain that.
Physics tells you about wavelengths of light, nerve impulses, brain activity. It doesn't tell you what the feeling of seeing red is actually like, its intrinsic quality. But when you see red, you know that quality directly.
So the only place we directly encounter the intrinsic stuff of the physical world is within our own conscious experience.
That's the implication. And this narrows the gap between mind and matter. Why? Because physics doesn't describe matter's intrinsic nature, only its structure and behavior.
So we can't say for sure that matter's intrinsic nature is fundamentally different from mental stuff.
Right. We have no scientific basis for that claim. A visual sensation, like seeing red, isn't some ghost in the machine. It's just an event happening in your brain, part of the physical causal chain starting from the object.
Okay, mind slightly blown. We've done the outside view, the abstract physical view. Now let's turn inward. Man from within, subjectivity, self, mind.
Yeah, tackling introspection and conscious experience head on. And this immediately brings up that classic clash, Descartes, I think, therefore I am,
Where thinking is the ultimate certainty.
versus the radical behaviorists like Watson saying introspection is basically useless, maybe even superstition. Thinking is just subvocal speech.
Watson claiming he didn't think, he just talked.
Which, yeah, Russell found pretty amusing given Watson wrote books. Russell tries to find a middle path. He agrees science needs public, verifiable facts. That's certain knowledge.
Yeah.
But he doesn't agree that introspection reveals nothing. He uses that brilliant toothache analogy.
Ah, yes. Anyone can see the hole in your tooth. It's public, physical.
Right. But only you can feel the ache. That's private, introspectable knowledge. And it's real, even if it's not part of physics in the same way.
So this leads to the question, do we know things, events, that aren't captured by physics?
Russell says emphatically, yes. Think of the person blind from birth who learns all the physics of light and color. They still don't know what it's like to see red. That subjective quality is known differently.
Okay, so introspection does give us access to a real domain of private experience. He then talks about distinguishing images from sensations. How does he do that? Liveliness isn't reliable, he says.
The key difference, he argues, is causal. Sensations are reliably linked to external causes, things happening out there that affect everyone similarly. Images depend much more on your personal history, your associations.
So if I look at a tree, the basic shape and color might be sensation tied to the actual tree.
Allowing you to infer the external cause. But if it reminds you strongly of a tree from your childhood, that feeling, those extra details, might be more image-based, arising from your past.
Got it. Sensational elements point outward. Image elements are more internally generated.
Exactly. And he uses this to define imagination and memory. Imagination is combining known bits in new ways. Crucially, without belief, they correspond to reality right now.
And memory.
Memory is usually not novel combinations, and it comes with belief that this represents something that actually happened.
That without belief part for imagination is interesting. He says it's actually quite sophisticated.
Yeah, because our default tends towards belief. Think about dreams or moments of high excitement. The as-if quality of imagination breaks down. We react as if it's real.
So what makes something a belief then?
It's influence on action. That's the pragmatic test. If you genuinely believe there's a tiger outside your door, you act very differently than if you're just imagining one. Belief gears you up for interaction.
Makes sense. Then, looking at perception from the inside, he draws a line between I see a triangle and there is a triangle. Why is that distinction important?
I see a triangle is a statement about an event happening in you, your subjective experience. It's very close to immediate certainty.
Okay.
There is a triangle is an inference. It's a claim about a public external object. It involves assumptions about an external world, so it's inherently less certain than the statement about your own experience.
Use the example of seeing spots before your eyes, right?
Yes, exactly. If you have floaters, you'd say, I see black dots. You wouldn't claim there are black darts floating in the room. The indubitable fact, the absolute bedrock, is just the occurrence itself. A visual black dot is occurring.
Whether it's caused by a fly or an eye problem, the occurrence of the visual experience is the basic, undeniable data point.
Precisely. That's the foundation of subjective knowledge. And building on this, he defines mind. Not as a thing, not a soul,
But it's
a group or collection of mental events.
So what makes an event mental? Is it a special kind of stuff?
Not necessarily a special quality. He suggests Practically speaking, a mental event is any event happening within a living brain, specifically in those areas linked with sensitivity and learned reactions. Mentality becomes a matter of organization, complexity, and causal laws.
A matter of degree, almost. So a mind is this complex pattern of events unfolding in brain tissue.
And remember his view of physics. Those brain events aren't little billiard balls bouncing around. Matter and motion are already constructions built from events.
Right.
So in a really strange reversal, Russell argues that perception gives us our most concrete, direct knowledge. Not of external objects, but of the intrinsic stuff of our own brains.
Whoa, hang on. So when I experience seeing blue, the blueness isn't a property of the sky out there. It's an intrinsic quality of the event happening in my brain.
That's the radical conclusion. The blueness is the brain event in its intrinsic nature, which is causally linked to the sky. We only know the sky abstractly, structurally. We know the brain event concretely through experience.
That is a lot to take in. Okay, let's quickly cover emotion, desire, and will. He brings in the physiology glands, adrenaline.
Yeah, influenced by people like Cannon, he acknowledges the bodily symptoms, trembling, heart racing, are real parts of emotion.
But they aren't the whole story.
No. He gives the example of getting an adrenaline shot. You might get the shakes, the rapid heartbeat. But if you know it's just the injection, you don't necessarily feel fear.
The cognitive part is missing.
Yeah.
Knowing what you're supposedly afraid of.
Exactly. Full-blown emotion needs that link. The bodily state plus the perception of an object, all colored by associations with past feelings, gearing you up for action towards that object.
Okay, and desire. Behaviorists see it as just acting to get something or stop discomfort. But introspectively, it feels like being pulled towards a goal.
Russell sees an evolution there. Simple organisms just react to discomfort. More complex creatures develop explicit knowledge of goals and the feeling of wanting them.
But he has that phrase, it feels like being pulled.
But really, you're being pushed from behind. Your current state and past experiences are causing the striving behavior, even if consciously it feels like attraction to the future goal.
That's a cynical, but maybe realistic take. And finally, will. Is there a willpower faculty?
Not really in this view. Will is basically just the learned association between thinking about a movement and that movement happening.
So it's a type of learned reaction.
Yeah. And deliberation when you're trying to decide. That's just conflicting associations, competing impulses until one wins out. No mysterious will entity making the choice.
Okay, behaviorism and physics seem to really pare things down. Now, a big shift. Ethics. He's not laying down rules here, is he?
No, definitely not giving you a list of thou shalts and thou shalt nots. His aim is more fundamental. Finding a basis for ethics. Why do we have moral rules at all?
And he's critical of rigid codes?
Vary, because they vary so much across cultures and history, and they often break down when you consider the actual consequences of actions in complex situations.
So what's his preferred basis? He mentions being influenced by Santayana.
Right. It's essentially a form of emotivism. The foundation is simple. Good is fundamentally derived from what we desire, and bad from what we have an aversion to.
So it starts with individual feelings.
It starts there, yes. But because we use words like good consistently in a social context, it comes to mean things desired by the group, or things that tend to lead to satisfaction of desires generally. It becomes social.
And from this basis, good linked to desire. What's the supreme moral rule he proposes?
It's this. Act so as to produce harmonious desires rather than discordant ones.
Harmonious desires, meaning?
Harmony within yourself, not being torn by conflicting impulses. Harmony with others in your family, your community, the world. Minimizing conflict, maximizing the compatibility of different people's desires. That's the ultimate ethical goal.
And this means moral education isn't just about teaching rules.
It's about cultivating the right kinds of desires, those that naturally lead to harmony. You can't just tell people to be good. You need to help them want the things that contribute to overall well-being.
That's a very pragmatic, almost psychological approach to ethics. Okay, let's zoom out one last time. The universe, truth, inference, our place in it all.
He briefly touches on historical figures of Descartes, Hume, Kant, seeing philosophy's progress, especially with modern logic, as moving from trying to prove things impossible to proving things possible.
Interesting. And truth and falsehood. He doesn't like pragmatism.
No, he rejects the idea that truth is just what works or has good consequences. For Russell, truth is about correspondence.
Between what?
Between our beliefs, usually expressed in words, and facts in the world, facts we can sense or remember. Verification is when things turn out as expected. Falsification is surprise. Our immediate beliefs form the anchor for checking others.
Okay, correspondence, but this leads right back to that really thorny issue, induction.
Ugh, the big one. How we justify generalizing from specific instances, seeing lots of white swans and concluding all swans are white, or, more importantly, expecting the laws of physics to hold tomorrow just because they held yesterday.
It's the basis of science, but logically, it's wobbly.
Extremely wobbly. It's very hard to find a purely logical proof that the future must resemble the past in these ways. Russell discusses Keene's work on probability.
Suggesting more instances increase probability, maybe?
Yeah, if the instances add genuinely new information. But even then, it doesn't prove we ever reach certainty. And the killer point, you can't use experience to prove induction is reliable because using experience already assumes induction works.
It's completely circular, a fundamental leap of faith, almost.
It seems to be. And he notes popular induction often relies more on emotional weight than sheer numbers. Touch a hot stove, once strong induction. Hear a word dozens of times before you're sure of its meaning.
Right, okay, so induction is a puzzle. He then revisits events, matter, mind in this grand space-time picture.
Just reiterating the core ideas. Fundamental reality is composed of events occupying finite regions. Points and instants are just useful ways we structure events. Matter is strings of events. Motion is changing relations between these strings.
And the self, the I.
Also a string of events, your biography. The sequence of experiences and actions that constitute you. He contrasts this with Descartes, I think, which he felt put too much emphasis on a unified thinking subject right at the start.
Better to start with the occurrence itself.
Yes, the indubitable thing isn't I am thinking this, but rather this thought or perception is occurring, like a visual black dot is occurring.
And this view ties into solipsism, the idea that maybe only my mind exists.
Right. If our knowledge of the external world is an inference from our private experiences, the occurrences, then it's not logically impossible that the inference is wrong. Belief in external objects is probable, sensible, but not strictly provable.
Solipsism is logically hard to refute.
But practically impossible to actually believe. Russell loved the story of the philosopher who wrote him, saying he was a solipsist, and was surprised there were others.
Huh. Yeah, kind of gives the game away.
So our knowledge comes through these causal chains of events. Some events, like our perceptions, we experience directly, know concretely. Others, events deep in our bodies, the initiating events and external objects we only know by inference or abstractly through physics.
Which brings us back full circle to that core point about physics.
Exactly. Knowledge of the physical world, derived from physics, is purely abstract. It gives us the structure, the mathematical relations, the causal laws.
But not the intrinsic quality, the what it's like of the stuff out there.
Correct. And because physics doesn't tell us matter's intrinsic quality, it gives us no grounds to say that quality is fundamentally different from the qualities we experience in mental events.
So mental and physical events might just be different ways of knowing or different arrangements of the same underlying kind of stuff.
That's the possibility this view opens up. They form one interconnected causal system. We know bits of it concretely, our brain, events, experiences, and other bits abstractly, everything else via physics. But it might all be woven from the same fundamental fabric of events.
Which is a completely mind-bending place to land. So finally, what does Russell see as the ultimate purpose of doing philosophy, of undertaking this kind of difficult thinking?
Its conscious purpose, he insists, must be simply to understand the world as well, as clearly as possible. It's not to prove things we already want to believe or to make us feel good or confirm our moral prejudices.
It demands intellectual honesty, questioning everything.
Even our most cherished ethical beliefs. But, he argues, this difficult process actually has good moral side effects.
How so?
It teaches us humility about our knowledge and power. It helps us see our own lives, our passions, our conflicts in a larger perspective against the backdrop of the vast universe. It fosters a kind of impartial contemplation.
He calls it intellectual asceticism, right? Giving up other desires for the desire to know.
Yes, it's demanding. But for those who pursue it, he suggests there's a unique kind of joy to be found. Maybe like a mystic's joy, but achieved not through faith, but through the hard work of reason and facing uncertainty.
Wow. Okay. That was quite a journey through Russell's outline. Dense, for sure, but incredibly thought-provoking.
Definitely. We've gone from, behaviorist explanations of learning and language
to the incredibly abstract, event-based world of modern physics.
Wrestled with introspection, what mind might be, emotions, desire.
Touched on his ethical framework based on harmonious desires, that tricky problem of induction.
And ended up pondering our place as strings of events in this vast causal network.
It really shows how, starting from that simple philosophical move, questioning common sense and following logic and science, can lead you to a picture of reality that's, well, pretty far from common sense. Less certain, maybe, but potentially much more accurate.
Yeah, less intuitive comfort, perhaps more complexity.
Well, hopefully this deep dive has sparked some aha moments for you listening and given you a clear handle on Russell's way of tackling these huge questions. You've definitely navigated some challenging ideas from these sources.
A lot to think about, for sure.
Absolutely. And maybe building on that, here's a final thought to chew on. If Russell is right, and our knowledge of the physical world out there is purely abstract dust structure and relations, no intrinsic quality, while our subjective experience gives us concrete knowledge only of events inside our own heads. What does that really do to our everyday certainty that the world we see and touch has a solid, independent reality with the qualities we perceive? How much can we truly claim to know about the world apart from our own minds?